It was one of the first new states born from the collapse of a bygone world. As World War I entered its final year, one ethnic group stretched across two disintegrating empires made their bid for freedom. In Russian-claimed Kiev and Austrian-claimed Lviv, Ukrainian nationalists seized power, declaring independence. Their goal? To unite their two statelets and create a Ukrainian homeland, a new nation that would take its place alongside emerging countries like Poland or Czechoslovakia. In this dreamlike era, success seemed almost a given, a natural outcome on a continent that was shedding empires. Yet it would be in the capital of one of those collapsing empires that Ukraine's fate was decided. Because up in Moscow, Vladimir Lenin is not about to let his neighbors go without a fight. That fight became the Soviet-Ukrainian War, also known as the Ukrainian War of Independence, and it would be one of the messiest, most brutal conflicts we've ever covered. As Europe's borders shifted, all kinds of armies poured into Ukraine: imperialist whites, Bolshevik reds, Polish nationalists, black flag-waving anarchists. In the melee that followed, there would be many winners, but sadly, only one major loser: the civilians of Ukraine. As the 20th century dawned, it was on a Europe cracked with fissures. Across the continent spread invisible ethnic and political fault lines which could split open at any moment, unleashing the geopolitical equivalent of the Cascadian megaquake. One of the biggest ran right through what we'd today call Ukraine. In this era, of course, Ukraine, like Czech Republic or Croatia or Poland or any of a dozen other modern nations, didn't exist, except as an idea. Instead, Ukrainians were largely split between two imperialist behemoths. In the west, centered around the picturesque city of Lviv, lay the lands controlled by Austria-Hungary. To the east, the vast agricultural plains claimed by Imperial Russia. But while the ethnic majority on both sides of this invisible fault line were Ukrainians, also known in this era as Ruthinians, their lived experiences of empire were wildly different. For Ukrainians in the east, life was marked by near invisibility. For a long time, their cities had been dominated by a Russified elite and a growing class of skilled Russian workers. The trouble was, from St. Petersburg's point of view, that these cities were mere flecks of paint on a vast rural Ukrainian canvas. So the Tsars decided to simply repaint the whole damn picture. That meant a policy of Russification, of discouraging the use of the Ukrainian language, of discovering a distinct Ukrainian identity. Come the 19th century, it also meant a blanket ban on anything even fractionally less Russian than an oligarch bear made out of vodka. This was the era of romantic nationalism, when minorities across Europe began looking to create their own written languages, their own literature. Eastern Ukraine was no exception. The mid-19th century was the golden era of Taras Shevchenko's poetry and nerdy academics in Kharkiv and Kiev trying to forge a Ukrainian consciousness. It was also the era of an almighty Russian backlash. In 1863, the Russian Empire's Polish minority launched an unsuccessful revolt. Overnight, minority languages went from cute things peasants do to dangerous rabble-rousing that must be stopped. In Ukraine, the backlash saw guys like Shevchenko arrested and exiled and using Ukrainian outlawed. Any hints of nationalism were pushed deep underground. The trouble was, nationalism's like a Pandora's box or a late-night tube of Pringles. Once you've opened it, there's no way that you're going to put that lid back on. Out of sight of the authorities, clandestine groups began to piece together a vision for Ukraine. In Kiev, a movement emerged for an autonomous country within a federalized Russian empire. Yet it was in Kharkiv that the most radical idea of all took hold. In 1900, the Revolutionary Ukrainian Party became the first to advocate the unthinkable, a Ukraine that was no longer part of Russia, but its own free nation. Or rather, they were the first to advocate this in the Ukrainian lands under Tsarist rule. Over in the Austrian-dominated West, nationalism wasn't just miles ahead, but it was goddamn light years. The Austrian Sea had picked up their Ukrainian holdings in 1772 during the first partition of Poland. Prior to that, the region of Galicia had been under Polish domination. So when they annexed what is now Western Ukraine, Vienna didn't just get a bunch of Ukrainian peasants, but also a bunch of extremely pissed-off wealthy Poles with the power to make endless trouble. Rather than go down the Tsarist route of speak our language or you'll have your vocal cords removed, moved, the Austrians tried a hands-off approach, letting the Polish elites keep their power. But they couldn't let them be too powerful, so they turned to a readily available counterbalance, the Ukrainians. Under Habsburg rule, Ukrainians in the empire were allowed to publish in their own language, to teach, to organize, and to dream of creating their own nation-state. Even after the failed revolutions of 1848, which saw Ukrainians in Galicia establish their own council and national guard and tried to merge with their eastern counterparts, Vienna kept allowing Ukrainians to do their own thing. There was even a Ruthinian delegation in the Imperial Parliament. Now, this doesn't mean the Austrians were more enlightened than the Russians, just that they'd cynically realized the key to retaining power in Galicia was to play both ethnicities off against each other. But it does mean that Western Ukrainians entered the 20th century with way more political experience and higher aspirations than those in the East. And that's important, because when it all goes to hell in 2 chapters' time, the 2 parts of Ukraine are going to have wildly different wars. So different that one side's allies will wind up being the other's bitterest enemies. For all the historical differences between Austria and Russia's approaches to their Ukrainians, their methods would become extremely unified in the fall of 1914. That's because World War erupted like Vesuvius, with Vienna and St. Petersburg, quickly renamed Petrograd, on opposing sides. The result? An eastern front in Ukraine that saw some of the bloodiest fighting of a supremely bloody war. As the Austrians were forced into retreat, they turned on their Ukrainian subjects. Thousands upon thousands were executed across Galicia for suspected treachery, often on the flimsiest of evidence. If that wasn't bad enough, the Russians then rolled right in, annexed Galicia, and started their own campaign of repression. In the months the Tsarist regime held the region, the Ukrainian language was banned, schools and bookshops closed down, and the local religious system dismantled. By the time the Central Powers chased them back east in summer of 1915, the region had become so avowedly anti-Russian that the returning Austrians were practically embraced. Yet for all the Western Ukrainians may have now considered Petrograd as trustworthy as a snake trying to tempt Eve to invest in NFTs, it would be entirely due to events in the imperial capital that their nationalist dreams became a reality. In early 1917, Russian civil society looked around at its war-shattered economy, its abysmal military performance and deluded ruler, and decided, you know what? Probably time for a bit of a change. On March the 8th or February the 24th in the Old Star Russian calendar, a revolution swept the nation, toppling Nicholas II. In his place rose the provisional government, which made one of its first acts ending the prohibitions on the rights of minorities. Barely was the ink on the declaration dry before Ukraine was racing for the exit. All that nationalism that had been forced underground in Kyiv, well, it now came bubbling back up, breaking through the surface on a wave of ecstatic victory. The Ukrainian language press was started, new political parties and cultural organizations opened. Most important, though, was the rise of the Central Rada. Formed that March in Kyiv, the Rada began life as a council on Ukrainian affairs before very, very quickly taking on the role of a government. By April, the historian Mykhaylo Hrushevsky had become its head, a position he swore to use to push for a wholly autonomous Ukraine within a federal Russian empire. For their part, the provisional government left the Rada to its devices. Aside from being liberally inclined, Petrograd's new rulers were simply too busy and too weak to consider disbanding it. But then the October Revolution came along, and a government far less kindly disposed to nationalist aspirations swept to power, taking place on November the 7th, and thus forever confusing the hell out of anyone not au fait with the Julian calendar. The October Revolution was one that you learned about in school. It was the one that took Vladimir Lenin from excitable bald nobody to excitable bald somebody. And that was super bad news for Eastern Ukraine's nationalist. On paper, see, Lenin was supportive of minority rights within the now former Russian Empire. In practice, though, he supported minority rights so long as those minorities immediately formed Bolshevik-supporting Soviets. And for all the Rada may have had some socialist leanings, it was about as pro-Bolshevik as you or I might be pro-smallpox. 13 days after the Bolshevik coup, the Rada threw down the gauntlet, declaring the Ukrainian National Republic. While Hrushevsky maintained they were still in federation with Russia, the Rada began passing a slew of laws designed to quickly get the public on side in case of a permanent split. Peace was promised. Land, a law that would give national autonomy for Ukraine's Jews and Poles. But while this went down well in the countryside and in the military, in the cities, it crashed straight into a brick wall of skepticism. Outside Kiev, urban support for the Rada barely crested 13%. In Kharkiv, a combination of industrial workers and Russified intellectuals used this dissatisfaction to set up a rival government. That December 1917, the Kharkiv government declared Ukraine a Soviet republic. One of its first acts was to invite the Bolshevik army into their country to defeat the Nationalists. In no time at all, Russian troops were pouring into the region, marching for Kiev. Trapped, desperate, the Rada pressed the nuclear button, the one that would blow Ukraine's political fault lines wide open. On January the 22nd, 1918, they declared independence. For the first time, a distinct nation-state called Ukraine had come into being. Now all that they had to do was make sure that it survived. At the moment independent Ukraine was declared, few people would have bet on it surviving days, let alone months. Right after the announcement, the Rada abandoned Kiev to the Bolshevik onslaught, retreating to a region known as the Right Bank, confusingly the name for the left-hand side of Ukraine as seen on a map. The Reds took the capital, effectively unopposed. So, that's it, right? The beginning of the end for independent Ukraine. Well, not quite. You see, the Rada was about to enter a marriage of convenience with a hulking brute of a bride, the tequila Joseph Joestar of muscular femininity. The bride known as Imperial Germany. As the new Ukrainian state crumbled, the Rada negotiated a hurried peace deal with the Central Powers. Signed at 2 a.m. on February the 9th, it basically boiled down to a contract to save the Rada from Bolsheviks in return for Ukraine becoming Germany's personal breadbasket. Left with no other choice, the Rada simply closed its eyes and whispered, "I do." The first peace deal of World War I concluded, Austrian and German troops flooded into eastern Ukraine, scattering the Bolsheviks like a bunch of frightened emus. At the same time, a separate German offensive in the north was rolling towards Russia proper. With Lenin's government, now headquartered in Moscow, already unstable, they were forced to cut a deal. Signed on March the 15th, 1918, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk basically gave the Central Powers everything they asked for. In Ukraine's case, that meant the withdrawal of the Red Army troops and a guarantee of independence. But the Rada didn't have long to celebrate. One of their key promises to the people had been land, but taking it from landlords and handing it to peasants would disrupt the 100 million tons of grain that they'd also promised to Germany. So the Germans simply turned their guns around and made it very clear that a new government was going to be needed. On April the 29th, Pavlo Skoropadsky was installed as Kiev's dictator. During local support from the moneyed Russified elite, Skoropadsky reorganized Ukraine into something called the Hetmanate, but might as well have been called something like the Kaiser's Effectively a German colony, the Hetmanate existed only to feed Germany's starving soldiers. While Rada supporters formed the Ukrainian National Union to organize a rebellion, there was little that they could do. So long as the Central Powers were backing him, Skoropadsky was going nowhere. And that, dear viewer, is what we in the trade call dramatic irony. That fall, the Central Powers collapsed. Bulgaria tapped out. The Ottoman Empire signed an armistice with its dying breaths. Austria-Hungary disintegrated into multiple new states. On October the 29th, the revolution broke out in Germany that would see a new government ushered in and a peace concluded by November the 11th. By then, though, a brand new Ukrainian state would have already been born. If you're wondering what's happening over in Galicia this entire time, the answer has been, well, not very much. After Austria retook the region in 1915, it stayed part of Vienna's empire, bar a brief Russian incursion in its eastern regions. That meant Western Ukrainians had missed out on all the drama of the Rada, of the Bolshevik invasion, of independence. Even when the Hetmanate was created, they'd remain firmly within Austria's chilly embrace, denied even the autonomy of being a puppet state. As Austria-Hungary entered freefall in the war's closing weeks, though, all of that changed. With the central authority gone, Galicia was suddenly up for grabs. In late October, Ukrainian nationalists under Yevhen Petrushevich rose up. On November the 1st, they marched into the city of Lviv, declaring it the capital of the Western Ukrainian National Republic. Then they kicked back, put their feet up, and watched with glee as their eastern cousins chased Skoropadsky from power. By mid-December, the Hetmanate had fallen, and the nationalists were back in power as the director of the Ukrainian National Republic. Yet there would be no time to celebrate, no chance to join all Ukrainian peoples into a single nation state, because the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian, German, and Russian empires had seen another new state come into being, one with its own historic claims on Galicia. Yes, it is time to introduce the next major external force into our already messy war, the newly resurrected Republic of Poland. When you clicked on this video today, you might not unreasonably have assumed that it was going to be about a singular war, the titular conflict between the Soviets and independent Ukraine. Well, sorry to say that that's absolutely not going to be the case. As we're about to see, the two Ukraines in this period were less fighting a single war than they were caught in a gigantic royal rumble, one in which a bunch of steel chair-wielding macho men were using their nation as the ring. On November the 21st, 1918, before the Hetmanate had even fallen, the first of these beefcakes joined the fray. That day, Polish troops attacked Lviv, sparking the Polish-Ukrainian War. Forced to fall back, Petrushevic's Western government regrouped at Stanislavy, today the small pretty city of Ivano-Frankivsk. There they managed to make contact with the Eastern Ukrainian Directory. That January, the two statelets agreed to merge, creating a single, indivisible Ukraine. Sadly, this new country would only ever exist on paper. Over the first months of spring 1919, the Poles relentlessly hammered the Western Ukrainians, driving them out of Galicia. By the summer, Petrushevich had been forced to evacuate, forming a government in exile in Vienna. Now, it's important to note the Poles only wanted Galicia. They didn't follow their successors by rolling ever eastward, threatening to take Kiev and Kharkiv and the Donbass. No, they merely reoccupied the Ukrainian lands that held prior to the 1772 partition. Still, this offered the Directory cold comfort at best. Now under the control of military man Symon Petlyura, the Eastern Ukrainians could only watch in horror as more and more wars engulfed different parts of their nation. In the southeast, an anarchist rebellion had broken out under the charismatic Nestor Makhno. By early 1919, they controlled a free territory centered around Huliapol that claimed 7 million inhabitants. To the east, meanwhile, the regrouped Red Army had reinvaded in December, resuming the Soviet-Ukrainian War. In February, they would force the Directory to abandon Kiev all over again. Nor were they the only occupying force. The same month the Red Army reinvaded, France took control of the vital port of Odessa, part of an attempt by the Allies to shore up the pro-Imperial Russian White armies. And speaking of the Whites, they were about to open a whole other front in the fast-developing Ukrainian quagmire. In May 1919, the Volunteer Army, under former Tsarist officer Anton Denikin, crossed into Ukrainian territory, part of a grand push up through Kharkiv and Kiev towards Moscow to overthrow the Bolsheviks. But while the enemy of my enemy may be my friend, Denikin was just everybody's enemy. Denikin and the Whites didn't just want to smash Lenin, they wanted to restore the empire, turning Ukraine back into a vassal state in which everyone played the part of obedient little Russians. And if that meant slaughtering and terrorizing Ukrainian peasants on their drive north and west, well, so be it. This is the multi-pronged nightmare that Ukraine found itself facing at the start of 1919, a series of colliding civil wars in which all sides were out to dismember their state. And that's just the basic overview. We've not even touched on the small-time Ottomani warlords running around killing and looting at will, maybe because the bigger armies will soon kill and loot on a much grander scale. Because, spoiler alert, no one's going to come out of this battle for Ukraine's future looking very good. Instead, we're about to watch things descend into an era of chaos, in which the only constants are backstabbing, violence, and increasingly horrific atrocities. When the dust finally settles, it will not be on a brave new nation-state known as Ukraine, but on a land drenched in blood. With so many armies crisscrossing its territory, Ukraine did what any unstable new state would. It collapsed. In most regions, central authority evaporated. And that meant a surge in violence. Most prominently, this came in a wave of pogroms targeting Ukraine's Jews. The reason for the anti-Semitic attacks that took place over 1919 are complex and legion, but the brutal truth is that every side basically made a point of killing as many Jewish people as possible. The Whites and the Ukrainian Directory allowed their forces to massacre Jews on the pretense that they were all Bolsheviks. The Red Army, by contrast, targeted them as capitalist and class enemies. The Ottomani, meanwhile, were straight-up anti-Semites. Over in Galicia, Polish forces celebrated taking Lviv by launching a 3-day orgy of destruction in Jewish neighborhoods. Even the anarchists committed anti-Semitic violence, despite Nestor Makhno publicly punishing soldiers who attacked Jews. In short, the birth and collapse of Ukraine was accompanied by anti-Semitic bloodletting on a scale rarely seen this side of the Holocaust. So intense was the violence that it's today thought that it killed over 100,000 people. So yeah, just remember as we go through this, pretty much everyone, be they Russian, Polish, or Ukrainian, nationalists, imperialists, or communists, spending their spare time cosplaying the precursor to the SS. Not that any of their various commanders likely cared much about the atrocities being carried out. They were all too busy fighting to get the upper hand. Summer 19 saw Odessa already vacated by the French and replaced with a Bolshevik-aligned force. With the most important port in Ukraine's claimed territory now taken, a race developed between the Whites and the Directory to overrun Kiev. On August the 31st, both sides entered the city mere hours apart, forcing the communists to flee. But this was hardly a joint effort. With the Bolsheviks gone, a bitter fight erupted for control of the capital. As the Whites gained ground, the Directory's forces were pushed into retreat, falling further and further back into the northern region of Volhynia. Finally, in December, Symon Petlyura found his army trapped between a rock and a Russian bear because yet another war had meanwhile broken out, the Polish-Soviet War. Yes, it's time for me to quickly condense yet another major conflict. Back in February, as Polish forces swept across Galicia, the remnants of the defeated German army had been retreating from the Eastern Front. As they went, the Red Army was following them and occupying territory the newly reconstituted Poland wanted for itself. On February the 9th, Polish leader Joseph Pilsudski decided it was time to show these godless Russians what a real vodka-drinking nation looks like and launched a counterattack. With the Bolsheviks distracted by a whole other war against the White armies in Russia itself, Pilsudski's army was soon rolling eastwards, gobbling territory like a stoner gobbling Pop-Tarts. And it was this hungry, devouring army that Petlyura and the Directory's forces found themselves directly in the path of that December. Trapped between two colossal armies, Petlyura's forces disbanded. Ceasing regular operations, they turned instead to guerrilla tactics against the communists, but not against the Poles. Realizing he needed powerful new friends if he wanted to see this state called Ukraine survive, Petlyura abandoned the front. He headed to Poland, and that winter opened negotiations with Pilsudski's men. In April 1920, both sides signed the Treaty of Warsaw. In it, Petlyura threw the Western Ukrainians under the bus, agreeing to give up all claims to Galicia. In turn, all Poland had to do was help the Directory defeat the Red Army. By now, the utter chaos in Ukraine was dying down, or at least simplifying. The Red Army had cut their own deal with Makhno's anarchists to take out the Whites, resulting in Denikin's army being driven from Ukraine by February 1920. While the Whites would stagger on in Russia and Crimea for a while longer, they were longer active players in the Ukrainian conflict. The board had been cleared, the rules of the final showdown set, a direct confrontation between the Poles, backed by the Eastern Ukrainians, and the Red Army. What happens next would decide the fate of millions. Even with the benefit of hindsight, it's hard to say at what point independent Ukraine went from real possibility to just wistful dream. Maybe it was when Germany overthrew the Rada and installed the Hetmanate. Maybe it was when Poland swiped Galicia. Maybe it was as late as Denikin's invasion. Whatever the exact point, it seems pretty clear that by the spring of 1920, the likelihood of Ukraine surviving the war was receding. Not only had Petlyura abandoned Galicia, it also lost most popular support at home. With a guerrilla force numbering in just the tens of thousands, there was little claim the Directory could still make to speak for all Ukrainians. But that's the trouble with dreams. They're hard to give up on, even when all evidence tells you that it's time to cut your losses. Which is why the Directory, the Red Army, and Poland's forces would spend the next half year chasing their own impossible dreams. Chasing them in a wild back and forth that looks a little like kids playing on a seesaw while unaware of the existence of gravity, constantly thinking that they'll just keep going up, only to be startled by their sudden return to Earth. The first to experience this whiplash effect was the newly combined Polish-Ukrainian force. In early May, they stormed into Kiev, dislodging the communists all over again, the high point on the war seesaw. But then the Red Army counterattacked, and the Poles and Ukrainians returned to Earth with a heart-stopping thud. With the White armies now toast, Lenin was able to call in extra units who'd been tied up fighting in Russia itself. That meant the counterattack didn't just dislodge the Poles from Kiev, but chased them all the way back to the outskirts of Warsaw. But this turned out to just be Moscow's turn at the seesaw apex, because the Poles devastated the Red Army on home turf before pushing them way back east all over again. And so it went. On and on. For 6 months. 6 months of carnage, in which maybe another 100,000 died. 6 months, which left the Reds, the Poles, and the remaining Ukrainian forces utterly exhausted. 6 months, which finally convinced Joseph Pilsudski that someone would have to give up on their dreams. It just wouldn't be him. In October 1920, the Poles and the Red Army called a ceasefire. They then hammered out a joint agreement to end the war. Signed in March of 1921 and known as the Peace of Riga, it allowed both sides to limp home with some gains and their dignity intact. But it was at a steep price for Pilsudski's erstwhile allies. To secure Poland's borders, Warsaw had sacrificed all hopes of an independent Ukraine. The treaty handed Galicia to Poland and the Eastern Territory claimed by the Directory to the Soviets. By now, two smaller western Ukrainian territories, Bukovina and Transcarpathia, had already been joined with Romania and Czechoslovakia. With this last treaty, the dismemberment of Ukraine was complete. For a short while, the Directory tried to fight on. In November 1921, the Second Winter Campaign saw a small force cross into eastern Ukraine in an attempt to spark a general uprising, but it failed when some of them were caught and executed by the Bolsheviks. It was the last military action the Directory would ever take, but that doesn't mean the dream of a separate Ukraine was completely dead. When the USSR was declared in 1922, it wasn't just a renewed empire in which the former Ukrainian National Republic was subsumed into Russia itself. Instead, it was as a federal state, one in which the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic existed as its own distinct entity. According to the historian Serhiy Plokhy, it was precisely to counter Ukrainian separatism that the USSR was built this way. Of course, much of that autonomy only existed on paper. Under Stalin, ethnically motivated crimes were committed against the Ukrainians on a scale the Tsar could have only dreamed of. Yet for all he might try, not even Stalin could destroy the seed that had been planted, one that would, decades later, bloom at last into a truly independent Ukraine. As for today's major players, they suffered a variety of fates. Symon Petlyura was assassinated by a Jewish man in Paris in 1926 for his role in the pogroms, while Nestor Makhno died in the same city in poverty just 8 years later. Meanwhile, the Rada's first head, Mykhaylo Hrushevsky, eventually embraced socialism and returned to communist Ukraine only to be purged. He died in suspicious circumstances in 1934, just 1 year before Joseph Pilsudski, now the strongman ruler of Poland, passed away from liver cancer in Warsaw. Had Pilsudski lived another decade, he would have seen Galicia annexed into Soviet Ukraine. White General Anton Denikin was the last to go. After settling in France, he finally moved to the USA at the end of World War II. He passed away in Michigan in 1947, aged 74, and with his death, our story, likewise, reaches its end. Today, the many wars that consumed Ukraine in this period remain relatively unknown, simply far too messy and confusing to be remembered by those who aren't history nerds. Yet this period still represents an epochal moment, an era when Ukrainians fought ferociously for their freedom against a larger oppressor. And while they may not have won the war, they perhaps won themselves something even more precious: a future.